Hey guys, welcome back to the arena. We got Peter Ahn here, jack of many trades, as I just got done saying, a sales coach, performance coach, an author, a host of a podcast, I believe, as well, has the pretty cool green lit microphone. Excited to get a conversation going, get to know Peter better. And as we do with all our guests, I've stuck some labels to you, but we'll kick it to you. We want to know, in your eyes, who is Peter?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you both having me. It's an honor to be on the pod. Yeah, as you said, I'm a sales performance coach, but recently also actually joined a company called Tiger Beetle. We have a real-time transactions database, so I lead sales and customer experience for them. Still do coaching on the side, still do speaking engagements. I think at the core of what I'm trying to do, whether I'm a coach or at a company, is really usher in this brand of authentic selling. I think that as salespeople, we often get a bad reputation, a bad label put on us. There's a lot of stereotypes. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of pushy, aggressive salespeople out there too. But I think, the elite sellers, the people who truly focus on genuine human connections, are the ones who get ahead and are able to form, really powerful partnerships on the business side as well. So that's what I'm passionate about and excited to dive into that and also my personal life too. I guess a little tidbit on that. I was born in Korea, moved to the US before I was a year old, but then bopped around a bunch of different states. I was in upstate New York as a toddler, moved to California for a year, moved back to Korea for a year, lived, my golden childhood years in East Lansing, Michigan, where I became a huge fan of Michigan State, the Michigan State Spartans team that won the 2000 national championship. And then moved back to California for high school. And the reason why I kind of mention all the places I lived is I've always felt like an outsider. I've grappled with my identity. Who am I? Am I Korean? Am I American? Am I Korean American? I think there's, a lot of work that I've done on just, realizing what I'm comfortable with and how I show up both in the personal side of my life, but also in the professional arena. So we can dive into that too. But hopefully that's a good, quick synopsis on me.
I guess I'd love to hear from your point of view. What about identifying Korean American? What about that was important to you?
Hmm.
Where did you struggle in terms of that part of your identity? And I guess as I'm asking that question, I'm thinking to myself about how I used to not take pride. I didn't like the fact that I was Greek Orthodox and that
Yeah.
much of my other friends were Catholic. It was just like cool to be I didn't one way or the other. I wasn't religious, so
Yeah.
I never was bought into either. But there was something
Sure.
just about being a part of and belonging that I was like, I feel like an outsider because I'm Greek Orthodox and I don't go to the same church as these people.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, I think the thing that was difficult, I was 8 years old. I'll go back to that, and when I first moved to Michigan, um, from Korea at the time. And I had just come off of like experiences in Korea where people would make fun of my Korean accent, and I also like, I think because I had lived in California prior, I was like probably more tanned, than most Koreans. And so coming off of that, I was already feeling insecure about my, American identity. And then the first day of school in Michigan, I got on a bus and I was so excited to get on a school bus, because they don't have these like big yellow school buses in Korea. And that excitement pretty quickly turned into like this confusing sense of shame because as I got on the bus, these kids were making fun of my eyes, right? How small they were, right? And calling me Chinese. So to kind of answer your question, like it just always felt like as a child, if you go through that experience, it stays with you, I think, as an adult because even me, I'm like 39 years old. I still remember what that feeling was. And so I've spent the rest of my life just trying to fit in and trying to figure out, okay, why is somebody who's different looking or has a different culture than somebody else? Why is the immediate reaction to ostracize than to welcome? And, the positive side of that is that now I'm highly attuned to that even as an adult where I think it's helped with my sales approach. Where because I felt like an outsider and I've always wanted to feel like I belonged, I do that to the other side where I'm trying to understand, okay, where are they coming from? it can't be just like a contentious negotiation, or it can't just be that they want to like push me around in this deal. There's gotta be some perspective that I'm missing. And so I think I'm now like highly attuned to that. But it started, I think, with these like kind of traumatic to an 8-year old, right? Like traumatic events where it just felt, why is it that I don't feel like I belong anywhere?
Yeah, and it reminded me of a thought that I had, which is, and this is just about what you're talking about is just your identity and a sense of belonging, which it's not something that should be earned or built or, and it should just be a given. And it's just this idea that no matter what you do, who you are, where you're at, there, so long as there's a critic, it will never be good enough, right? Like there's nothing you can do that can ever just be good enough in this world. And so I just want to understand, like, at what point did you like, was there an inflection point? At what point did you realize that attaching into this idea of authenticity would ultimately be the answer, in which you were no longer trying to bend into more of the American identity or bend more into the Korean identity, but to
Yeah.
just bend really into who you are?
Yeah, I think it happened. The first moment of me feeling the power of this was when I first closed my first enterprise deal when I was at Dropbox. So this was like in 2013. And Dropbox was a consumer company. People would be like, Peter, my grandma stores her photos in Dropbox, but you got to be kidding me. You think like NBC Universal is actually going to store Saturday Night Live episodes in Dropbox? Right? Like they have Microsoft, they have Box, which has a similar name to Dropbox, was like the enterprise version of us. And in that deal, there were multiple moments of instances where it was hard to be honest, but where I leaned into that. So I'll give you like a cultural one example, and I'll also give you kind of a deal related example. On the cultural side, I remember Lenny Bloom was like my champion. He was like the VP of collaboration at the time. And I remember thinking, I was like a 28-year-old sales guy in tech. Even though it's very progressive, I was surrounded by people who didn't look like me. A lot of Asians went into like being a doctor or lawyer or maybe doing like coding, right? Engineering. But they didn't really go into sales because it wasn't looked at as like a noble profession. But I happened to get into sales, and I remember thinking, okay, all these guys are like super confident, gregarious. They're living the American dream. They've lived this all American life, and they're taking whining and dining our clients to like these fancy steakhouses, right? And I was like looking up steakhouses to take my sponsor, Lenny Bloom. And I was like, you know what? This just doesn't feel like me. Like it feels stuffy to go to a steakhouse. At the time, K-pop wasn't really a thing, right? But and Korean barbecue wasn't a thing either. But I was like, you know what? Like where I'm in my element is when I'm, taking people out and sharing my culture through food. So I decided to take Lenny out to Korean barbecue. And at the moment, it was like a huge thing for me, but I didn't think it would be like I didn't think it would make a massive impact on Lenny. But years later, we still keep in touch and go to Korean barbecue now. And I've known him now for like 12 years, right? And he now like takes his family to Korean barbecue on his birthday. And they had never like had the experience before he met me, right? So this like power of making that personal connection, he told me was a huge thing on his side because he could see the authenticity in me, and it made him trust me more because I was the real me and I wasn't trying to be someone else, right? So that's like one example of leaning into like authentic culture. The second example I'll share is with the same deal. As I told you, Dropbox was seen as like a toy. They were like, you can't be serious trying to sell this thing in the enterprise. And NBC, where Lenny was at, ended up being our first Fortune 500 customer. And there was a critical moment in the deal where he was like, Peter, I had done this like full day of executive meetings at Dropbox, wined and dined him. And then he's like about to head out to New York because the meetings were in San Francisco. And in the elevator, I'm like, I'm just ready to kind of relax, maybe grab a glass of wine. But then in the elevator, he's like, Peter, I just have one final question for you. And I was like, oh boy, here we go. What is this going to be? And he was like, my final question for you is, who is your largest customer? Right? Because it's important for me to know. And our largest, NBC was 42,000 employees, Fortune 500 brand. Our largest customer was 2,000 employees. And at the time, a lot of tech salespeople would be like, because there were like the Dropboxes, Airtable, Notion wasn't really a thing, but like all these product led growth companies were starting to light up. So a lot of sales reps would be like, "Oh yeah, we have Disney, or we have like CBS, or we have Turner Broadcasting," but it's kind of a lie, right? Because if somebody signs up for your product, if some random like person signs up for your product, doesn't mean you have Disney, right? It just means that somebody signed up and they happen to be at Disney. So it's like, should I say that to feel impressive, or should I tell them the truth and say, listen, our largest customer is a fraction the size of NBC Universal? And I decided to tell the truth, obviously. But it was kind of a moment where I was nervous to do so. But again, years later, or weeks later in this case, because after we closed the deal, I asked him about it. He said that was the right answer because he wants to be an innovator and he wanted to know he could trust the other side. So I think this is where authenticity plays out in like two very different examples. But I think the point is that as I explain it, it sounds obvious. But I think there's moments as salespeople where it's hard for us to tell the truth and it's hard for us to be honest, but it's the only answer if you want to build like long term, like truly trusted relationships.
And so, how has your relationship? It almost sounds like sales was your therapy in a way, meaning like
Yeah.
a lot of people go to therapy to work through the relationship with themselves or emotions, and sales was almost a vehicle for that. I guess, how has your relationship with yourself evolved, whether through work you've done through therapy or just more broadly, like through the work in sales?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, you're exactly right. It was very therapeutic for me to have a portion of my life where I could just show up as my full self. And that became sales for me, ironically. And I still go to therapy, by the way. I recently started therapy probably like 2 years ago. Finally found somebody that I connect with. And my wife has been pushing me to do so because there's a lot of personal things that where I wasn't able to feel like I could show up as my full self. And so the sales journey has impacted me in a way where it's provided inspiration for me to do the same thing in my personal life. Right. And I think for a lot of people, they find that personally they're able to be authentic, but when they're at work, they clam up. For me, it's like the opposite. It was the opposite. At work, I'm like in my element and I feel ultra confident all the time now because I have this conviction that honesty is the only way to go. Um, and I'm not looking for perfection in work, right? I'm looking for like the realness. But in my personal life, there's like a lot of examples of that where I'm still working through that, right? So I think that's a really interesting thing you pointed out because it has been therapeutic, and I'm trying to map that to my personal life too.
W- It's really interesting because I feel the same way where, and I think I've talked about this before, where I feel far more confident in my own skin with my authenticity at the workplace. I'm also in sales, right? So it's probably
Yeah.
something here where I think the environment um, really provides the evidence that your authenticity is what wins. And as sellers, that's the name of the game, so to speak, which is figure out what wins and double down. And I think what we find out in those environments is that the more vulnerable we are, the more authentic we are, the more honest we are, the more genuine and trusting the relationships you build will be, both externally with clients, but also internally with the people that you work with on those teams. And I
Yeah.
think it's because of my experience in that environment that I've grown that sense of courage to go and take that vulnerability and authenticity to, different types of therapies or to, family and friends. I've become a far more emotionally attuned being,
Hmm.
far more in depth and open to different circles of friends and family. And I don't know that I ever connected it back to, until hearing it from you, connecting it back to, we need that confidence to come from evidence and we need that evidence to come from somewhere. And I think for you and me both, um, our evidence came from the sales environment.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. Yeah. Completely agree. And you triggered something as you were saying that. And in sales, I think we're allowed to choose who we work with almost. I think like the best sellers know how to prioritize folks who are on the same wavelength as them, right? And I think personally, that's something I'm trying to like take a page out of for my own life. I think it's harder for us personally to do that, right? Because you can't necessarily, outside of like your wife, I guess you can't choose your kid really, but you can't choose your parents, right? You can choose your friends, but sometimes we get stuck into this inertia of, hanging out with folks that aren't good enough for us anymore because of certain reasons, right? Because they're not being productive for where we want to head. So, anyways, I think there's a lot more challenges in the personal arena, to be honest. Whereas in the professional arena, that feedback loop is pretty clear and it's a little bit faster, right? Even though enterprise deals take like 6, 9, 12 months, you kind of know when you're on the wrong path with the deal, right? So,
And
It's go ahead. Go ahead.
I guess then to pivot a bit and a question for you, because you've mentioned you've found a therapist and you've gone into therapy, and I sent something to Matt as recent as yesterday, just the conversation around therapy, which I would say is really where this podcast started. Was a
yeah,
lot of our conversations were about maybe the misconceptions around therapy, especially for men,
yeah.
and curious to understand some of your healing journey. What have you had to work through, and how has therapy served you?
And can I
Yeah.
add on to that question? And
Yeah.
also just given your cultural background, just because from
Yeah.
what my understanding, going to a therapist, someone outside to seek help and talk about your feelings, I know can differ by background. I'm just curious how your culture also played into that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm culturally like Korean American, but my parents were immigrants from Korea, right? And in Korea, it's like taboo to talk about your emotions. And so I wasn't used to talking about my feelings. In fact, now I'm finding out through my therapist that the reason why I'm so attuned to people's emotions is because I wasn't really allowed to feel as a kid. And I don't think my parents ever told me they loved me, right? As an example, right? Which is completely opposite to how I raise my son, right? In fact, he gets annoyed because he's like, "You tell me you love me too many times." Right? So I have like the opposite problem. And so working through, I think, the fact that there's so much trauma still that I hold as an adult, and it comes from when you're a child, and it comes from your culture, and being okay with that and understanding that no matter how much you heal, there's people around you that still won't change. I think that's been like a big unlock for me because I spent so much of my life trying to people please, trying to get the assurance from my parents that I was on the right path. But I'm realizing there's, a lot of stress, trauma, there's a lot of unhealthy things that can come out of that sort of mentality because then you don't end up allowing yourself to enjoy the moments of life you should enjoy, right, as an adult. And so I think it's very much linked into culture. And I guess I'm alluding to what I'm working on in therapy. It's a lot of like, how do I become an adult with childhood traumas that I haven't yet really fully conquered, right? Or addressed. How do I keep moving forward, knowing that there's imperfections about me that are not going to take a year or two to address? They're going to take probably decades, right? And then how do you also break the generational cycle of knowing that your parents are your parents, but understanding that you have completely different values from people who raised you, right? And so I think that's what therapy has helped me with is like how do I take the good with the bad? Because there's a lot of positives too. Me walking on eggshells, like I said, means that I like care about people and how they feel to almost like an extreme. Some people might call that people pleasing. Other people might say, and me included, like that there's definitely some positives to that, right? And people feel that when they engage with me. But then understanding also that there's deep, deep trauma that we all hold and that we need to balance the good with the bad, I think is something I'm still working through.
And I think we all are. I mean, I don't think, I've been in therapy for, I think you said a couple years. I mean, I've been in therapy for maybe 3 years, and I feel like I'm still uncovering things, not even just through therapy, but through other modalities as well. And I think you kind of answered your own question. You said like, how do I do it? But I think it's by recognizing what you just said, which is that we're imperfect and
Yeah.
that we're always going to be growing and learning and uncovering different things. And I think being okay with that is kind of foundational to continuing down that path. Otherwise, it would be incredibly easy to get discouraged to, this isn't worth it. This is hard work. I'm just going to go back to my old patterns, that type of thing. Um,
Totally.
how do you, I was curious, you mentioned a lot about authenticity and human connection. How do you be authentic and connect genuinely with human beings, whether if this is in the workplace more broadly or whether it's specific to selling, however you want to take the question, but like, how do you do so without trying to do so? Meaning, like, how do you be
Mm,
authentic without trying to be authentic? How do you connect with human beings without overtly trying to connect with them? Because I found in my personal experience as someone newer to the sales world, running my own business, where I am my business, is like I want to
yeah.
connect with people, but sometimes I think I try to do it a little too much instead of just being
Mm,
myself, where I'm naturally, I think I connected well with people. So I'm just curious for your perspective on that.
yeah. So my perspective on this is, and I don't know if it'll resonate with you both, but I try and seek out people that have the same values as I do, right? And this is why like I agreed to be on the podcast too, right? Because the more that you talk about your opinions, the more you attract people who have similar views on life, right? And I'll also say, hey, like sure, like we should be very accepting of multiple views, right? And like I should spend time with as many people who are different from me, but let's be honest, like we're getting old, right? And like that's an idealistic view of the world. I'd rather spend time with people who give me energy every day, right? And the people who give me energy every day speak my language, think similar to me, and allow me to be myself. And I can feel whether it's a cocktail party or an event or a sales call, I can feel when people just don't have the same values I do, right? When people are looking for perfection or when people are looking for the headlines over authenticity or transparency, or they value that, right? In a sales call, for example, like to get really tactical, there's some people who are like, hey, listen, we're a $18 billion public company. This is not going to fly with us the way you're trying to like convince us of using your like little startup platform. And there's like one way is I could try and connect with that person and really try and convince the person through like authenticity or transparency. But at the end of the day, that person's probably not going to get convinced. So then it's a fast path to me saying, listen, if that's what you care about, like let's just stop the conversation right now because I'm not going to convince you we're not a startup. I'm not going to convince you that there's, no imperfections to our product. And it's the same thing as a human being, right? If you don't appreciate what I bring to the table in terms of personal values, like let's just save each other time because you have like your energy providing circles and I have my energy providing circles, and I know when my energy is being drained. And right now I can tell you my energy is being drained, right? I'll like think that in my head and then think about a fast path to ejection. So I think that's kind of what I believe in. And people might say, well, how do you do that as a business that's trying to sell the world? There's no business that needs to sell the world. I think the most successful businesses sell to people that they like selling to and who give them energy in return, right? There's a bunch of people I would rather not sell to, that don't follow my paradigm or my perspectives. And I'm pretty sure I can run still a very healthy, fulfilling business, right?
Yeah, and I think that that's wonderfully framed, and I'm just curious to better understand to what extent you allow for gray space and gray area because and I don't
Mm,
know that the world that you're in today, but when you're reconciling for quota, how much give are you willing to give when there maybe is somebody that you don't necessarily jive with, but there is product fit, there is interest, and you're not
mm,
looking forward to communicating with this client. They do drain you of of your energy. You do have to show up to a Zoom call with them once a month, whatever it is.
yeah,
But the product solves the problem. There's fit, there's budget, all the qualification criteria hits.
yeah.
Speaks to some of the gray area there and how how
Oh,
much you're willing
yeah.
to maybe flex.
I love this question because when I joined the company I'm at right now, about 6 months ago, me and the founder had like a sit down dinner, and he was like, Peter, what's your like 16-year vision for sales? I've never had anybody even ask me for like my 2-year vision of sales, right? So I was like, okay, this guy is thinking differently, right? And what I told him was like, I just want sales to be seen as a profession where truly focusing on trust and authenticity is valued, even over revenue, right? And so why is this an interesting thing is as I joined the company, we made the decision And by the way, a lot of customers tell us, or a lot of prospects who learn about this tell us, you're not going to be able to keep this up. But we made the decision to not have quotas and to try and actually do that for as long a time as possible, because we both firmly believe, me and the founder, that the energy of the customer and the prospect is just as important, if not more important, than the revenue, right? Because if the salesperson doesn't want to talk to the prospect, customer success probably won't want to talk to the prospect. The product team probably won't want to do things for the client or customer, right? And it's a radical view, right? This is why people laugh, because they're like, you can't run a business like this. But if somebody actually truly ran a business off of building trust and authenticity, I think it would do way better. And I think it's really interesting when you think about the largest companies of the world that are highly optimized for earnings calls. Sales is not seen as like the pinnacle of their brand, right? They're seen as these order takers. Nobody likes being like, oh, let me go jump to a call with Oracle. No offense to Oracle salespeople, right? And it's not even about the people on the call, really. It's about the fact that it's a machine, right? So, I guess what I'm trying to say to answer your question is I'm trying to make it so that there's no gray area, like in terms of like the gray area being dictated by quota. There still will be gray area around like, hey, is this person energy providing or energy draining, right? Because that could be subjective too. But I think having the conversation around, do these people respect us? Do they have the same values as us? And are they going to be good customers for the next 5 to 10 years? It'll, I think, like radically reduce that gray area and also allow us salespeople to do things based off of what we're best at, which I think is reading people and connecting with people, right? But we often take that out of the equation because of things like quota, like you're saying.
And I think we're ready for a radical conversation, because I think we are at this tipping point, if you will, where people are only becoming more and more modern and progressive in who they are generational wise. And so
Yeah.
your client is somebody who actually does start to value, like you're saying, they're going to actually share the values of authenticity and honesty. And when you think about the pressure that a quota can create for people, is yeah, I am going to maybe bend my answer towards dishonesty because I need to close this deal because I need to satisfy a certain target, right? And I mean,
Exactly.
Matt, you're somebody who, the brand that you sell is authenticity and compassion and in this space, right? And you are somebody that, I don't know, you are your own boss. I imagine you don't give yourself too much of a quota. I'm curious to hear your perspective selling without maybe that looming performance metric that you have to hit by end of week, end of month, end of quarter to keep your own job, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it's, maybe it's just me. I've never been in a sales capacity at an organization, so I can't really speak from that. But I'll say
Hmm.
I think it's incredibly difficult because I am 100% commission, and so
Sure.
it is difficult at times to, which is kind of what I was interested for your guys' perspective, to balance, because you could pretty quickly tell when someone's, like you said, on your energy is going to make your life easier, not more difficult. Balancing that with like, oh, but this person's actually going to bring me in and pay me to do it, and
Yeah.
I've got rent to pay and mouths to feed, a dog to feed.
Sure.
So
Sure.
balancing those two things when I am 100%, on the, I bring in 100%. That's it. There's no biweekly paycheck and things of that nature. I think it's actually incredibly difficult. I wouldn't say I figured out.
Totally.
I don't have the blueprint to balance those two things. I will say, obviously, when you're first starting out, I mean, sometimes you've got to make sacrifices. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm perfect, and I've never done business with someone that really wasn't my cup of tea. But I think the
For
more that I
sure.
built my brand, and the more, I guess maybe it's more of a self-worth and a confidence thing, the more that I
Yeah.
feel confident being like, this isn't the right fit.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm turning away dollars, but I mean, I will gladly personally take a lower speaking fee, for example, if that person is easy to work with, if they're
Totally.
communicative, if they are
Totally.
transparent, if they are honest with where they're at in their process.
Yep.
To me, that is worth money. And I
Yeah.
will,
Exactly.
of course, I'm going to go out with my standard fee, but if they're like, hey, Matt, we only got X, I'm going to be much more inclined to work with that person in the present and in the future, when they're, like, you kind of going back to what you're saying, when they're trustworthy, when they're honest, when they're communicative, when things get tough, they don't just ghost you, but they actually like, hey, like, here's where I'm running into a roadblock. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right. Like, because early in my coaching journey too, I definitely took on clients that just didn't work out, but I still took them on, right? Even though I had this spidey sense that, oh, they're going to be difficult or they're not going to get the value out of what I'm best at, right? Which is like phraseology, sales tactics, and mentality versus like, am I going to fill your pipeline with millions of dollars, right? Like, those are, I think, two different things. And so, yeah, I agree to your point. I think it's experience, right? Once you've been through the cycles, both bad and good, you realize, you know what, there is a reason why I should now be, turning away clients because in the long term, I think, focusing on the folks that are right for you, that have your values will make your life a lot easier. Yeah, but it's hard, you're right, when you're trying to like pay rent and you're just getting your business off the ground. But I think I hope more people take that risk if they can, to say no, because it's such a powerful thing to provide clarity around why you're doing what you're doing.
And I also think like something that is maybe being understated is that you're not saying I'm going to be authentic and work with those that I vibe with at the cost of revenue or at the cost of performance, right? The
Yeah,
belief here is that the more that we lean into trusting that authenticity wins optimally, maximally, that you're actually going to be better off. You're going to perform
yes,
even better. And there's an abundance mentality that comes from this piece. And I think more back to managing a sales team where I understood the phone language and the email language that worked for me, but the more I matured in my management, the more willing I was and the more I was able to realize real time that the more that you can actually trust and empower your salespeople to lean into their voice, to lean into their
yeah,
authenticity, to trust that those were the best quarters I had ever performed. And quite frankly, some of the most stress-free ones because I didn't feel like I was pulling the wagon by any means. Rather, I was
totally.
looking for to unlock empowerment of the people who had the talent and the ability, really just about do they have the belief and the confidence to go out and execute it themselves. So,
Yeah, I
um,
love that.
yeah, it's having that belief system and that trust and then leaning into that.
Yes, yeah, and people still buy from people, right? That's like an age old saying.
Yeah.
I don't think we're gonna have AI signed contracts anytime soon, at least for like the big strategic ones. And people can sense confidence or lack of confidence pretty quickly. So I wish more managers and leaders were to do that, to focus on like, how can I help your confidence, not how can I fit you into like a discounting matrix, right? Because sales has gotten to the point where buyers kind of expect discounts, buyers expect salespeople to get desperate end of quarter. But what if you were to turn that on its head? What would that do to your client relationships? And I've seen it time and time again, turn like, desperation into like long trusted relationships when you say no. Like, no, I'm not going to discount, or no, this isn't what we're going to do, even though you expect this of salespeople, right? And that only comes from confidence.
I guess how do you build that confidence, especially for people that are maybe first starting out, whether it's sales or non-sales related? Like how have you been able to build confidence out throughout your career? I mean, you mentioned the maybe a pivotal time with Disney and how that person what I think is Lenny.
Oh, yeah.
Um
From NBC. Yep. Yep.
yeah, like maybe that was like a pivotal moment, but like how have you build self-confidence in yourself and also build self-confidence in people that work with you?
Yeah. I think for me, it was, I just made a decision pretty early on in my career that I wasn't going to lie, like no matter the situation. And that was like a core principle that I wanted to abide by. And I think it's because as I was getting into sales, I saw a lot of people lying. And it just like it created so much friction with my own personal values. And so it was still hard not to lie because you always want to be in sell mode, but I had kind of made that non-negotiable with myself, right? To answer your question, how do you do that as a young person these days? I think again, this is why I do a lot of these podcasts and why I have a YouTube channel, why I wrote a book, is because I think people need to be told it's okay to walk away. It's okay to say no. It's okay to lose the deal, right? In the short term, to win the longer term respect of someone who is highly principled, right? And so a lot of the young people I talk to, it's kind of similar to this, where they're like, hey, like they ask the same question. They're like, but how do I do that within the construct of my quota? Or like my boss the other day told me to do this when I knew it was wrong. Like, what do I do without getting fired? And again, like we all have mouths to feed and we have a check to bring home. But my answer usually is like, listen, like you got to figure out an exit path quickly because it's only going to get worse if you're in an environment where you don't feel like you can be honest and authentic and genuine, right? And so that's what I would say is like surround yourself with the people who have similar values and understand that the people with power sometimes got there not because of honesty and transparency. There's a lot of people who got to where they are by lying, right? But that doesn't mean that's the right path, right? Just because there's a lot of pressure to go down that path doesn't mean you have to do so, because there's a lot of like implications for your own mental health, your own like long-term reputation that will rear its head, down the line.
And so to think about some of your career pathing where you were a lot of what you talk about, it unfortunately is not the majority, maybe not even close to the consensus of the environments that you came up in, which simply put, tech, B2B sales, right? And so just curious to understand how and when were you able to maybe muster up the courage to go so far against the grain as to like start your own thing, to really speak out about this stuff, to write a
Mm,
book, to create your own business, to say there's a better way to do this and we need to disrupt the current modern way of thinking about not even just sales profession but like the corporate profession or any
totally.
profession. Just the way that we're operating is so much larger than just a sales role. At what
Yes.
point did you say, like, I'm so outnumbered, but yet I'm going to have the courage to kind of step out of the box and go against the grain to the extent that you did?
Yeah, so it was when I started my own business. I'll be honest, before I started my own business, I was afraid of backlash, within my peers, my bosses, my managers, my investors. It felt like there was a lot at stake. I wish I would have done this a little bit earlier, because what I realized too is there was a moment in time when I started my business and I wrote like my first post about being an Asian American in tech, and it kind of like took off. And all these people started reaching out to me publicly and privately saying they felt the exact same way. That's when I realized, wow, like I'm actually not outnumbered. I'm just outnumbered in the public sphere, right? And it's because we all think there's so much at stake with our careers if we're honest. And now that I've done this for what, like 3 years, I'm still an infant at this actually. I'm realizing, every time I record a podcast episode, there's people that come out of the woodwork, and they're not just Asian Americans, they're like all across the board who are like, I felt like an outsider in this situation. I felt misunderstood in that situation. And so I think that was a moment when I realized there's this like kind of undercurrent of people who have always felt this way, where I was like, you know what, I got to go against the grain. The other thing too is like, I'm like a complainer with my wife and my friends. I'm like, oh, did you see that guy? Like, did you see this person? Like, I can't believe they made $100 million, or I can't believe they're posting about this on LinkedIn, right? And so, um, as that was happening, it was like unhealthy, right? Just to complain and complain about it. So I was like, you know what, I'm gonna turn that and into something where I can just talk honestly about the fact that these aren't the important things that I want to talk about day in and day out. And so now that I'm like talking about it more publicly, I complain less and less with my friends and my wife, right? So I think like that was also kind of something I remember where I didn't want to just keep it inside of me. It was also like somewhat therapeutic to start talking about it.
Yeah, for sure. Peter, to wrap this up, what in life are you most proud of?
Oh, wow. That is such a good question. I think in life, what I'm most proud of is such a hard question, actually. I'll say what I want to be proud of, and I hesitated for a second because there's always things I could improve on in this area, but I just want to be like a loving, reliable husband and father, you know? Like I want my wife and son to look back and say like, you know, Peter actually did everything that he could to build a healthy, loving life for us and for like the generations that come after us, right? So that's what I would love to be proud of. And there's a ton that I could work on there, right? But that's what I would love to leave this earth with.
That's a beautiful answer. All right, Peter Ahn, everybody. Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you guys. This is awesome. Really appreciate you having me on.
That was great.